Welcome to the Center for African Studies Africa Table, and we are hosting our beloved Professor Trevor Goetz as our speaker today. He is a professor of African history at San Francisco State University and was awarded the prestigious African Studies Association Service Award of 2026. He has been affiliated with Stanford as a visiting professor in history, African and African American Studies, and computer science. His current projects seek to meld fast methodologies like AI-assisted research with slow methodologies, particularly comics and photo essays, in ways that allow us to identify critical challenges in each. So I am now going to welcome Professor Trevor Goetz to introduce his talk today, after which we will have a Q&A session, and you can enter in your questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you so much. I realized I just raised my hand by mistake there. I think I fixed it. It's nice to see so many old friends and interlocutors with whom I want to speak with in the attendee box. So even though I can't see you face to face, thank you for joining me. I am looking forward to talking about a project that I've worked on for a while now, and that Robin has helped me on at times, been my colleague on as well. But the broader issue that I want to talk about really focuses on the question of AI's existence in the context of African studies, and the questions of ethics and data sovereignty and access and the opportunities and the challenges that it presents. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about some statements that are guiding my work, both about archives in general and then about AI. I'm going to call it artificial intelligence, even though it's a collection of technologies that I don't think are intelligent. And then I'm going to talk about some of the tools, and in particular History Genie, which was built on campus at Stanford, that we are working with, and then the ways in which we hope we might surface some answers about the ethical, data sovereignty, and access questions we have about tools like History Genie. And then I really want to listen, because it's time to have, I think, large conversations about these kinds of tools and their implications, and indeed about the broader AI framework in general as it relates to both Africa and African studies. So because History Genie is a type of archive, I want to start out by saying that archives are a problematic thing. The third statement here is actually the thing that I want to start with, that archives can produce healing and they can produce pain. And we need to recognize that archives are not morally neutral, and that we work with them ethically. And also that most archives are controlled by states or by large, powerful entities, and they are a technology of power. They are a way in which power gets exerted. But, while we say that, we know that because archives can heal, that democratic archives, that people bringing out archives that we didn't know existed, archives with new epistemologies and new types of sources, can be an amazing way to reverse some of the harms of the past. But none of these archives are static, and so we cannot remain static in the way that we manage archives. We have to change. Now, I think about AI in this regard in a somewhat similar way. And first of all, I want to say that AI, as we know it, especially large LLMs, are a technology that are controlled by powerful bodies, by and large, that reproduce rather than extending human ability to do things, to do work, to create. And they do so by reproducing, by being trained on existing bodies of knowledge, most of which are very problematic and very biased. And, the technologies of the past created biased archives as well. And AI, as it currently exists, and especially large corporate LLMs, mostly just reproduces and extends those biases. So I make an argument that we need to contest the structures that are right now generative AI. Um, but it's hard to do because there's little architecture that really allows for us to do so. And it's not clear how we do so, how and whether we can use artificial intelligence as a tool to empower people or to bring in perspectives from the margins or perspectives from below when that architecture is epistemologically designed, ontologically designed, I should say, and is it operates in ways that concentrate power in a few. Now, in working with and presenting on these issues, I've come across, I think, two perspectives that are in tension and that I think we need to represent both of, because I think from the beginning I need to acknowledge my here anonymous colleague who recently wrote, "My objections to AI are grounded in an understanding of what African history, does as a discipline. We try to recover historical subjectivities, and there's no way to really, and to redress historical inequalities, there's no way to really do this with this artificial intelligence tool." And what this individual is expressing, and I know many respected senior colleagues who agree, and I treat them with respect and listen to them, is the idea that we shouldn't participate in the AI world, the AI infrastructure, we should oppose it. Um, I more follow Darren Acemoglu, the economist, who argues that actually, we can look at the past, we can see what technologies benefit humanity and which don't, and we can contest new technologies. That isn't to say that technology is ever neutral. I do believe there are ethics of technology, right? I do believe there's good philosophical work saying it's not just technology is neutral and humans use it well or badly. It's more complex than that. But I do think that I'm on the side of the argument that says if we don't participate and contest it, we'll be leaving this technology of power in the hands of just a powerful few. And for West Africa in particular, this will have a lot of implications. So, so here are questions that I have, right? So, is it possible to actually build AI tools, to build generative AI tools that can serve the needs of our scholarship and the needs of the communities with whom we interact or not? And in doing so, is one of the advantages that AI tools can improve access, is one of the advantages that they can help us to better understand the past through proper use. Is it possible that generative AI can also be a technology that empowers people who are not necessarily elites, not necessarily in the Silicon Valley space, to do so, to shape knowledge, to contribute to it? And if so, how? If so, what does it look like? What does it look like to create tools that are, and I'll just say that are like good or ethical AI tools? And part of the reason that I helped to work, I mean, it's the biggest joke in the world that I was for 1 quarter a professor of computer science at Stanford. I laugh about it. It's like big head from Silicon Valley getting a job. But nevertheless, working with computer scientists to build something, part of the reason was that we can then test it. We can then say, and if it's not ethical and we can't make it work, we can shut it down. And I'll talk about that and the complexities there. Part of the process I've engaged in is really looking at what African producers are and creators are doing to create archives. A couple of things I wanted to tell you about because they may be interesting for you to look at. One is archiving, which is a Nigerian site by Nigerian creators, a large staff of them, who have, amongst other things, digitized a large body of 20th century modern newspapers, magazines, and they say transcripts. I'm not sure what that refers to. I didn't see any transcripts. That you can do semantic search. They've been transcribed with AI assistance. These are fantastic, and I think they do a lot of really good practices, the kind of practices I'll be talking about. I find this project to be inspiring. I've been following along with Lalapa as well. I don't know if any of the others of you have. Lalapa is designed for low resource languages, so specifically to create AI opportunities and tools in languages that are not commonly highly represented in the big corporate tools, specifically in African languages. I will say that Lalapa is a commercial tool developed largely for human resources assistance to replace human resource experts with with AI agents, but in lower resourced languages. But it's an interesting tool. And recently Google and the University of Ghana and the Education Ministry of Ghana, so this is because I focus on Ghana, this was of interest to me, have been designing an AI project and community center with a $37 million investment. I'm following that project along as well. So there are many projects, and you probably know of many others out there. But I can mainly talk about History Genie, which is online right now. It's this project that been built by folks from the Center for African Studies like Robin, Stanford-built Lab, and me. And History Genie was funded by, among other things, Stanford HAI and the Brown Institute, a little bit of money from Alfred P. Sloan. And the original idea for it in part came from my class, one of my classes. So I want to tell you that story briefly, and then return to the ethical issues. So indulge me a little bit as I talk about History Genie. So I teach a class at San Francisco State in which I've always wanted students to work with sources with perspectives specifically produced by West Africans, and especially 19th century Anglophone West Africans that I work with in my own research, and for whom I had this huge body of PDFs, mainly of newspapers that nobody else really had seen. I had tried previously in many ways to create a digital project out of it where people could access these newspapers as PDFs, which meant you had to go through them the way you have to go through large bodies of PDFs, but I couldn't really use it in my course. Or I found it difficult to use in my course because in a semester, in a short period of time, it was difficult for students to really get to know these archives or to do discovery in them. And one thing I knew was that students are interested in research if they can discover something that connects them to it. I've always had students who come up to me and say, okay, I'm willing to do research in African history, but I want to do sports. And I said, well, I don't know if I have any sources about sports because I don't care about sports that much, to be truthful. And a lot of other of those kinds of connections. So I wanted a tool that would help students have a bigger body of African sources to work with. That would be free, that would be open, and that would allow them to also search through huge bodies of information relatively rapidly and effectively. And so I proposed History Genie to the folks at the Oval Lab, who fortunately were interested in something similar, mostly working with journalism, which was great, and making accessible newspapers in the 20th and 21st century. And so we got 14 West African and one Southern African newspaper that mostly people don't have access to. In fact, most of these are not available in West Africa. They were available in London if you could go to certain archives, or in Canada. And so we hope to increase access. And it basically what could happen then in this first iteration of History Genie was that working with an engineer, we could upload these PDFs. An LLM tool would read them, transliterate them into machine readable text. And then we worked through a number of workflows that could be useful. So you could go into a particular newspaper and do a semantic search. So here in this search, I said, is there any mention of race or racism in this newspaper? And it would be able to use its AI technology to search better than a simple word search or an old Boolean search to pick up those kinds of questions. By the way, a lot of the West African discussion about race and racism is actually about racism in the United States, which they were very cognizant of in the 1890s and early 20th century, which I found interesting. So I wanted students to be able to do that. And if they found things, and by the way, all of this, I hope you're thinking about ways in which there are problems or challenges with this, because I agree, right? That's what we want to talk about. But if students found stuff, the citation would be right below. They could go directly to that page and still, as humans, look at the page, right? So that was important. And then I also wanted students to be able to search the whole body of sources through what the computer scientists call a chat function. Now, I hate calling it chat. Tell you the truth, I'm not that interested in chatting with a computer. But let's call it prompts and responses. So here's a prompt. What was the role of railways in the economy? It's actually not that well written, a prompt, but I was working with a student on this. And you would get answers that, again, would draw from all of the sources together, would be organized based on patterns that were noticed, because I agreed that AI does seem to be good at noticing patterns. And that would have direct links right away to the articles so students could go to those articles. So here we have AI just as a sort of research assistant tool. And I was very comfortable with that. Um, Importantly, the backbone for all this work is an LLM that was developed here at Stanford by the Oval Lab called Storm. That is, again, based on many of the problems that large commercial LLMs have. It's a smaller LLM. It is it is trained only with vetted sources. It's independent. It's not tied to a corporation or to profit per se. Um, and it seemed like an ethical way to do it. And that provides enough of a sort of training base for History Genie to understand the questions we're asking and come up with useful answers. It's also, because it's smaller, it's slightly less energy consuming, water consuming, etc. And it's backed up by another tool that was developed there called WikiChat, which ensures there are no hallucinations, or tries to ensure there are no hallucinations by actually checking all the data that is retrieved against reliable sources and against the corpus that we're drawing from itself. So it's a built-in fact checker rather than having to ask, are you sure this is right? But again, what I wanted it to generate was responses that give access to the primary source, not actually some sort of report or large paper. I didn't want it to do the paper itself. I wanted my students to do the paper. And then what I've done outside of History Genie is to develop a whole curriculum that takes my students from finding a research topic in which they go through History Genie and try to ask questions and find something that interests them. My students, among other things, have been interested in sports and have found things, and fashion, a lot about fashion and things that aren't necessarily at the center of my research, all the way through developing a research question, building literature reviews, thinking about perspective, thinking about sourcing and bias, thinking about context, all these sorts of things, all the way to actually writing a full paper. So it started then in my classroom, and as I said, my students have been writing papers for the last 2 semesters of this class at San Francisco State based on this research. And their papers are much, much, much better than they were before. So I'm very happy in that respect. That doesn't mean this is a good output, but I'm very happy with that in an educational setting. In terms of being a research tool, I've been working with researchers who work in 19th century West African history to use these materials. And like any other digital sort of access, it's got advantages that you can, no matter where you sit in the world, you can look through this stuff. But the additional advantage I get, and I realize that there are critics of sort of online armchair research like this that say you should be in the place in the archive. But if we can put that to the side for a moment, the advantage of having an AI engine here is that it's pretty good at organizing data in many ways. So recently I was working with a graduate student who's interested in electrification. And we put in a prompt about electrification and electricity, and we got back a lot of mentions of electricity, some of which were unknown. And again, the advantage here is speed, right? This system works much faster than you or I could go through 15,000 pages, 20,000 pages, right? It gives you a response really quickly. is it problematic? Might it miss things? Is it problematic to outsource this kind of search to an AI? Should the researcher be doing this kind of search? Those are the kinds of things we have to talk about. Um, but it returned, I must say, a lot of really, really interesting responses. Some useful to the grad student, some not useful to the grad student, about electricity coming to West Africa, about electricity as a psychological and philosophical force, about all kinds of things. Some of them reproducing debates happening in London at the time, some of them being actual perspectives by sort of West Africans writing about it. And in each case, of course, there's a footnote and it takes you directly to the source. So, so in that regard, it's advantageous, and researchers who I've worked with, Tony, don't be shy that I'm showing your picture here. Tony Yeboah and I, we really right at the beginning, we did a search for him a little bit on perspectives about Kumasi and the social environment of Kumasi. Um, that was, again, facilitated, really fast response, pretty much everything about Kumasi that was in these newspapers, which were coastal newspapers and therefore didn't have that much about Kumasi as it happens. Benjamin Wendorf, I worked with recently, and he responded by saying, look, it sped things up, which is great, but it did increase his confidence that he could see the citations and such. So great. This technology exists, and we're constantly trying to prove it. But should it exist, right? So is this actually a good thing? Should it exist? So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the questions that have arisen as we've gone along about should this thing exist, right? And I think one of them is just the broader issue of whether we should engage AI or not, right? So it has an ecological cost, it has a social cost. I've made the point to some people that, Western scholars flying to West Africa also has an ecological and social cost. So, let's be fair and judge everything, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't judge it. Um, this is a thing that's being built at Stanford, by ethical scholars who I think, I really admire, but who will control this thing, right? How do the descendant communities, for example, get to look at these things, get to talk about these things? Um, um, Sorry. Something that came up quite early. So Sina is the lead PhD student in Oval Lab who's been working on this. He said, look, OpenAI and other sources are trying to take the stuff that's on History Genie and integrate it into their training. Should we allow them to do it? And I talked to my students at the time, and to a select group of colleagues, and I said, Sina, let's not let this go into OpenAI yet, this stuff. But maybe we should let it. Maybe OpenAI and these places groups will benefit a lot from having these perspectives. On the other hand, uncontextualized, I don't know, right? But I think that's something we need to talk about. Do we want these materials to inform and train the larger LLMs or not? Early on, some of the computer scientists, who again I have huge admiration for, but they said, should History Genie with Storm write a paper? If you ask it for a question, should it write a report? And I said, no, not yet. I'm not interested in that yet. I think, Robin, we talked about that, I think, but it was a discussion at the time, because we feel like it's an AI assistant for us, but we still want the cognitive work to be done by humans. Um, and then just basically, like, is it a good methodology even to allow History Genie to replace humans in searching? It's fast, it's awesome, it'll give you responses really fast. What'll it miss? What context does it not get? What will it hurt? Because the act, of course, for a historian of searching through something is partly an act of working through the intellectual issues. So, a number of the participants in this project recently wrote an article, it looks like, going to, in part, be part of a forum on this topic in the Journal of West African History. And just generally, we're hoping about, we're all, those of us participating in this project are hoping for a scholarly discussion to really emerge on this topic. And it is emerging from numerous sites. There's been a lot of work on this. And um, but more work needs to go on. It needs to be, I think, directed to these issues I'm going to talk about at the very end here. I also want to say that this project and several others like it are going to be the subjects of a discussion at the Ghana Studies Association this summer, since most of these newspapers are mostly about Ghana or the Gold Coast, with I think some really responsible scholars um, who can talk about these sorts of issues and really consider them. And we want it to be really directed, and not just to talk about what's good and what's not good, but more importantly, to talk about the issues of how should these tools be governed. Um, so I'll go really quickly through the next part, but I just want to say a few things. So I've been looking at models that might be useful. One of these models is the Tanzania Adelaide Declaration on sort of indigenous rights and governance regarding archives that Lauren Booker of the Jumbunna Research Institute in Australia brought to my attention when I asked folks about this. Um, it is, I think, a really great framework. It is not focused on AI. It is a pre-AI framework that, nevertheless, I think has a lot of foundations for talking about issues like access and ownership, and recognizing identity and questioning epistemologies in going through these kinds of archives. And this is the kind of statement that I would love to see made about AI tools um, being ethical tools within a framework of what we know about inequality and issues like that around archives. And a second principle network that I'm looking for, and I'd love other recommendations, by the way, was put forward by the Design Justice Network. And those principles are principles of design. And again, they're slightly different, but I think they have a lot of important points about who should be seen as an expert, whose voices should be centered, how, maybe some things shouldn't be done, even if they'd be useful for researchers, if they're going to have a negative impact on communities. And I think that these are, again, the kinds of questions and principles that we need to come up with at this point. So I'll close out by saying the questions that I'm most interested in now and that I think we need to discuss. And in closing out, I'm really inviting as many comments and questions as possible. What communities do we need to start with being at the table? Like even to start with this kind of discussion, where do we have to start? Again, I started by building something and then, hoping to have something kind of to critique or comment on. But I understand that in some ways you should start with the conversation before anything gets built. What can co-design look like? What are the kinds of schemes of organization even that would reflect the kinds of things that we would want that would be equitable? So far, this is all text, right? Grant Parker and I have suggested, other things like 3D objects and audio and such be included. But thinking about what that would mean is also important. But maybe we shouldn't be privileging text all the time. Metadata schemes, whose frames of reference to the metadata schemes and represent, and should they, represent the scholarly researchers or the communities who should own these sources? Should people just use the sources without any context? I mean, I got to tell you, if you search these sources because they're created by people in the 19th century, you can get some stuff that seems confusing to us or problematic. Do we need context? Should we create annotations so that users can annotate and provide information for other users as you go along? Should we allow the knowledge in these archives to get into the AI sphere or not? And of course, access, right? How should people access them? And should they all be open? I mean, there is a debate that I'm having with some folks. I've been talking to folks in the context of eugenics histories. People who work in eugenics believe that archives of the history of eugenics need to be made available so that we can see the history of forced sterilizations in California, for example. But those are also health records, and if you make them available to everyone, of course, it's deeply problematic. So, what should be done there in terms of access, or even the debate that was had by the folks in the history department at Stanford and elsewhere about the Senegal slave liberation database and names and the question of names, right? Should people's names who were enslaved in the past be made public through an archival project, or are there issues there as well? So I will close there by saying that um, I'm hoping people have strong opinions on some of these issues. And I'm not afraid of criticism, amongst other things. But I think this is a time when we need strong opinions. And I would love to know what all of you think about these questions moving forward. So I will stop there and turn things back over to you, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting the goal of your project, the larger implication of the project, and also the importance of thinking about the audience and the users for this in these kinds of tools. Um, I do want to follow up with a question, if I might take that liberty, about who gets to define what is moral and ethical. And you mentioned participation by annotating some of these entries into the corpus that we've put together. Um, might that be a way, or might that cause more confusion because individuals might have different interpretations of the materials that are available?
I mean, I think that that's a fabulous question. Look, I realize that, I'm going to do a CYA scholar thing here and just say I am at the place where I also have more questions than answers. Um, However, saying that, I've been thinking a lot about annotation and editing, right, if you will. I'm going to call it annotation, not editing. I've been thinking a lot about annotation because what I found is that my students um, need a lot of help in understanding these archives, and I worry um, if they aren't annotated and people are going into them naively, that there may be problems. Let me give you one example, if I may. And I realize I'm talking about my students, but they've been 90% of the users so far have been the 100 or so students in my classes. So one of my students, a young but and naive but fantastic young student, got really excited about sources from the 1890s um, that were talking about a subject she was interested in. She considers herself to be a member of the Goth community, and there were sources talking about cannibalism in the Congo, right? And she got very excited. Now, halfway through the semester, she said, "Here's my topic." And a large portion of the class could tell her, well, what you think that this is about the Congolese being cannibals, but what it's really about is about the deprecations of King Leopold and the famine that colonizers are creating there, and this sort of thing. And so you're reading Belgian sources that are saying the Congolese are cannibals rather than admitting that they were part of the problem that had created this enormous famine in Congo. And you need to reorient yourself. Now, it may be that my student was particularly naive as a reader, but I worry about opening access to things that reinforce incorrect interpretation. I'm going to say incorrect, right? There's some things that are just incorrect. And I think about the opportunity to contextualize things that allow us to mobilize our mass human information to to reorient people away from those mistakes, or just even help them understand this perspective. I mean, there's a way in which what's really fascinating is if you don't go out to the whole worldwide body of knowledge in an LLM, but you're only using a very small corpus, you can almost start to get a perspective better, right? You can almost start to get it. And in some of these newspapers, there are two perspectives or two groups of perspectives. There are 19th century West African elites who I'm very interested in and it's fascinating. And there are the Europeans who are speaking to them. Um, and they both have biases and they both have these sorts of, and I think human provided contextualization can help. Um, but um, but I agree that it can introduce error as well. So I'm not sure what to do about that, Robin, but I do think that is a big question. I see a couple things in the chat as well. Do you want me to answer those or
Pardon
okay.
me, sure.
Okay. Um, so wondering about in-person visits to the archives being replaced by digital armchair research. Um, well, Pramesh Lalu maybe 15 years ago wrote an article kind of against digitization. Pramesh is at the was at the time at the University of Western Cape, um, and I thought it was a really interesting article in which he basically said the reason that we go and do research in the place is because we want to be immersed in the place, and we want to and that's also context that you need. And if you don't have to go to the place, if you can just sit and do research through digital archives somewhere else, your work becomes less accurate, simply less accurate, right? Maybe problematic in other ways. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that has to be part of the discussion, right? It has to be part of the discussion. Another part of the discussion has to be the fact that I had a bunch of newspapers about West Africa that nobody in West Africa could get unless they could get on a plane and fly to the University of Ottawa or the newspaper archives in London. And providing them access then was a good thing. So I do want to say that I think that this is a debate about digital archives generally, and it's something that I think AI, because AI can make digital archives available so much more rapidly than the technologies we had before, it increases the urgency of that question. Um, there are a couple more. So there's one thing here from Aaron Covey Aaron, hey, that says there's a lot of evidence showing Gen AI companies like Perplexity ignore do not crawl instructions on websites. Yes, that's true. That said, the programmers on this particular project are pretty damn good, and they they told me that actually they thought they could stop it for a while, and I kind of believe them. They're Stanford PhDs in computer science, so I thought that might be true. Um, uh, Robin, do you mind if I keep going, or do you want to ask these questions? They're not coming up in Q&A; they're coming up in the
Please
chat.
feel
So.
free.
Okay, all right. Harrison, see you next week, Harrison, says, I think special attention needs to be paid to the handling of oral tradition. Um, Harrison, you're so right, right? I mean, the thing about oral tradition is that on the one hand, we as scholars see us as scholarship, but people in societies who do oral tradition, it's just a practice, right? It's something they do every day. It's part of their lives. And if we don't understand that, if we don't contextualize it that way, if we don't help them understand, if we don't help people outside understand, what is this practice? Nepia Mahuika's book on this subject, I think, is particularly great. Um, the Maori scholar, and I think you couldn't be more right. You couldn't be more right. And as we begin to have the technology to transcribe audio, well, we have the technology to transcribe audio. We have to think about that in particular as well. 100% hard agree on that one. And then Professor Fatima Alari says, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I'm not as optimistic about AI. Hey, I mean, I do want to say I don't consider myself an enthusiast, but perhaps I'm more on the enthusiastic side. So, the first question, does digitization for AI processing replicate colonial extraction? Um, that is a really good question, right? And so I think it depends in part who does it, who does the work, and who gets to participate. I think in general, knowledge transfers and the negotiation of knowledge and power are questions of having the hard conversations about who gets to do this. So if I, as an American, say to the people, running this low language HR experiment in Southern Africa, if I say you shouldn't do that because it's bad, um, aren't I also just somebody in the West saying, hey, you Africans shouldn't do that thing because we've deemed it bad? So, I mean, I think there is a question about these conversations that we should have. I mean, that's why I fall on the side of we need to have these conversations and soon and openly and broadly rather than the side of we need to not participate in AI. Whose knowledge systems? Yeah, I mean, all of these questions are the right. In fact, I'm just going to cut and paste this directly into my notes because I think these are among and I also want to invite all of you to email me to say, as if grants happen and things like that, to have these conversations. I want to be part of them, um, because these are all the right questions. Um, Apparently, I can't cut and paste from the chat. Would you mind? Can I get a copy of the chat afterwards? Would you mind? But um, these are how do AI training data sets reproduce colonial taxonomy? These are all the right questions. And I hope I made it clear that I was raising exactly those questions um, about those conversations that we need to have. So I agree. Thank you. And hi, Pauline. Um, Abdullah Sinai. What about the language issue? Yes, that is right. Low resource languages is maybe even a name that we don't like. I don't know if we like this name, low language resources for languages. Look, there is, John Mugan is he at Harvard? Yeah, is particularly working on an AI African language project. There are some people who believe that AI actually has the potential to make digital space more accessible for people whose languages are less represented, and they're very positive about it. And then there are others that are absolutely less optimistic about the potential. And I think that's right. I think we don't know um, yet. But again, it's a place where we need to think about um, these kinds of issues and carefully and slowly, right? Slow down and do it. Um, Jennifer Hart. So, Jennifer, the digital history scholar, the people who actually know digital humanities always ask these great questions, right? I mean, who owns this? Where does it sit? Who pays for it? Who pays for the credits to allow searches to happen? I mean, so far we're funding it through grants. Um, who pays for the energy? Is the cost of the energy to run this outsourced to communities the way it is in the U.S.? I mean, China's already got a better, I think, and somewhat more fair structure for doing it. But yeah, how do you make these things sustainable? And I think that that's also one of the huge conversations um, that we have to have if we decide that we want to participate and keep these things. So yeah. Um, Sarah, hi Sarah. Nice to quote unquote see you. So Sarah's question is about discovery, right? Um, and more importantly, I think about contextualizing what discovery actually means. If you're like me and you've sat in archives, you often find stuff through. Um, Sarah says laterally. I don't know how better to say it, but almost by mistake, almost because it sits next to something that you're looking at. Um, and should we let the algorithm do it? And again, Sarah, I hope I raised that question as a real question. It's true. Um, when my library at San Francisco State went from OpenStax to digital retrieval, I tried to figure out what I was losing because I could order a book, but I couldn't go and see that book and then by mistake or by design see the 100 books next to it in exactly the same category and maybe find something that would be even more useful. And in fact, I remember having this debate because I opposed the library going to a digital retrieval system. So, so this is a very pressing issue as well. I'll tell you what my students discovered. They discovered that to some degree, initial discovery in particular was easier, right? Because to go back to the sports example, the student who was interested in sports and isn't really interested in anything else, the student is at college to get a degree and was a business major, but was interested in sports. Found articles on soccer that sent them down the pathway of actually something that was engaging to them. I think that was fantastic and useful. Did they miss stuff? Yes. And it's a challenge. I think everything's a trade-off, but what I want to make sure that we do is we ask questions about all the technologies, the same way we ask these questions about AI, because there's lots of things we do. One of the things I was discussing with a colleague recently is if you ask AI to a generative AI tool to look at your ideas and they add a new idea, I would do that in a heartbeat with a human colleague, right? And when I say add, they propose a new idea, they propose something different. I would do that in a heartbeat with a human colleague, right? Get feedback. Is it fundamentally different to ask Gemini to give me feedback than it is to ask my European historian colleague? Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe it's not. Um, I'm very pleased to have somebody tuning in from Zimbabwe. Um, um, and you may be too flattering in calling what we've done so far a center of excellence. I do want to say, in answer to your question, an interesting thing, which is I am well aware also as an editor in a journal that many scholars located in Africa who are doing good work, but whose work isn't accepted by Western-based journals, are finding generative AI to be a good tool to rewrite their syntax in ways that get them their articles accepted, which I think is such an interesting point. But in an era when so much garbage is available and where real research is consistently undermined, is there a way in which centers of excellence can start to research and understand facts from the real actors? Again, I'm gonna actually, if you don't mind, take your quote and put it into the discussions that I want to have, which is fantastic. Um, Matthew, I hope I kind of answered my take on the sustainability problem, but it's maybe when I was answering Jennifer's question, but maybe not. Um, Part of the sustainability problem with this sort of material is this. Um, Inevitably, what happens is that you have to go into a corporate in architecture, cloud-based architecture, and pay credits for the searching that's being done, right? And so inevitably, there's a continued cost that you're paying to Google or Microsoft. Can you still hear me? Did I freeze? Okay, I froze on my screen. That you're paying to Google or Microsoft or somebody like that. And I think that is an additional challenge that is very, very difficult indeed. There is a question about whether I can provide the name of the two Nigerian archives. So .ng is the Nigerian suffix online. And the one that's actually Nigerian that I mentioned is called archive, ARCHIV .ng. I think they've done a good job. Um, um, as an African AI practitioner, thank you. I'll add that some of these questions about coloniality and the low resource language nomenclature have been addressed in CS architecture. I agree, and I'm not expert enough to address them well. But I do know that folks that are working on these issues similarly, I read all the material as much as I can, the material about these kinds of questions, and they're under debate. Grant, what success have you had in stopping students from composing entire essays out of AI? Grant, this is I'm sorry that I'm not on campus today, but you and I will talk about this. By building an entire semester's infrastructure in which students have to incrementally turn in a lot, and have to turn in um, informal writing that we do in class and have to turn in formal writing and have to turn it in using media that I can search for their edits, um, and things like that. I'm able to, I think, largely get away from that problem. I failed two students this semester for turning in AI generated materials. Um, so yeah. Um, can I keep going? Is this boring or should I keep going, Robin?
Yes, continue. We have a few more
Okay.
moments.
Okay, good. Well, I always like a comment that starts with "This is impressive work." It makes me feel good. But um, I'm curious about your thoughts on the risks of relying on a single source archive, particularly how such dependence might shape the outputs of AI assisted analysis and student research. Also, how you're thinking about data collection, stewardship, and ethical responsibility when materials are housed in foreign institutional repositories, even digital ones. Um, so let me start with the second part, if you don't mind. Because I haven't yet had the discussions that I hope to have this summer in Ghana with Ghanaians, I'm not sure how to answer regarding the particularly Ghanaian perspective on data sovereignty issues. However, many of us, including some people that I know are on this call, have encountered plenty of archives where people say, I've been burned by Google before. I'm not interested in something that involves Google and things like that. And I assume that sort of thing will happen and we'll have those discussions. And like I said, I am willing to go so far as to say, I think we should cut it all off. That this, people in the communities we're supposed to be serving don't like this. If that happens, it is a big, big question, and who should steward and who should make decisions. These are the big questions that I hope to have, and that you're all asking the right questions about, I think. Regarding the single source archive, so let me present that the single source archive is the same as doing oral history work with a person. It's much worse for getting accurate answers and much better for understanding perspective. So, um, in in one of these newspapers, a lot of my students pick out the fact that there are a lot of articles written by people in Accra and Cape Coast saying Dahomey is a really bad, evil place. And my students say, is Dahomey a really bad, evil place? And then we look closely and we say, no, this is a time when coastal Ghanaian merchants are competing with merchants in Dahomey. This is a point in time where the British are very anti-Dahomey, and speaking that language gives you certain advantages, right? You can, again, they don't have the context and they don't have the annotation to pick it out, which is what worries me. But what you really get when you do this kind of thing with these smaller communities sources or individual sources is you get a lot more perspective and bias. Perspective and bias is really interesting. It's good stuff. It's what we want to know. But it's only interesting if you know how to work with it and understand where you're coming from. I mean, it's a problem. It's a risk, and it's also a positive thing. Joel, so nice to see you, even if digitally. Do you ask the LLM to be self-reflective and critical? List items that seems relevant. Ask it like, what did you include and why? Um, and I just froze it. No, okay, there I am. Joel, I have not done that. However, part of the reason I have not done that is because I I kind of was very conservative, and I think that the other humanities people on this project were very conservative in what we wanted the AI to actually do for us. We've kind of limited it. We've limited all the possibilities, and maybe we should just let loose and say, please allow History Genie to produce big reports, and then we can ask it about why it produced the reports that it produced and things like that. I've been more conservative about that, but I think I get the point that you're asking, which is, um, would we be able to get it to reflect on, or would we be able to understand the algorithm and understand what it's doing if we're able to do these things? I guess one of the slides I should have had here that I don't have is the things that I don't think AI can do and that we've tried where I think it's kind of failed and that are really interesting to me. Um, it's not really good at doing time, change over time. So if I say, how did this change? How did the perspectives of Accra merchants about Dahomey change over time? Even though it has the data about the time, the dates of the different newspapers, it's not really good at doing that. Like humans seem to be much better at doing that. I mean, I know if I go to ChatGPT and ask it to do that, it can do it to some degree, but that's when it starts to make a lot of mistakes also. Assessing significance. If I say which is more, and the programmers I worked with did do this. They said they queried it to say what are the 100 most important stories in these newspapers and such. I don't think it was good at assessing significance. I really don't. Like for me right now, this is a limited but really useful tool. But like you've got to also know what its limits are, and it's been interesting finding out for myself what its limits are. And part of what I've been thinking about, if we should have these tools, if they should be public facing and open, et cetera, is what not only what historical context do we provide, but what training and instruction do we provide to users about what this will be good at and what it'll be bad at, or ChatGPT for a while had a little thing on there that said you may get wrong answers. I don't know if they still do, but I think these are all really great questions to ask. I hope you don't feel like I'm sort of trying to do damage control by saying these are great questions rather than providing answers. The truth is that this presentation comes at a time when I'm really starting to apply for grants and work with people to apply for grants to have the opportunities to talk about not only History Genie, but also other tools that are out there and how they should be governed in the context of West Africa. And so these are all, I think, really the right questions to ask at this time. And that's really authentically where I am. Robin, can I turn it back over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for exploring the various ways that we can engage with African history and AI and all of the challenges associated with that. Thank you to the attendees for participating, not just in the listening to Trevor's talk, but engaging in the Q&A session. I think there were some great questions. And I want to thank Bolu for putting the webinar together. She made sure that we had attendees in place and also all the technology worked. So thank you to everybody. We hope you have a good afternoon and we hope to see you at the next Africa table.